At my son's engagement party, his fiancée grabbed my arm and whispered, "You need to go now, and don't come back." I smiled and said, "All right, but I'm not leaving alone." She didn't understand what I meant until she saw who walked out with me. Then she screamed, "I'm a retired civil engineer. Spent 38 years calculating load tolerances, stress fractures, points of failure. You do that long enough, you start seeing it everywhere. In bridges, in contracts, in people. My wife, Lorena, passed 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. After that, it was just me and my son, Sawyer, in a house in Boise that suddenly felt like it had too many rooms. We figured it out the way men do, poorly, at first, then better. Sunday dinners. Yard work on Saturdays. A standing argument about whether the Broncos had any business calling themselves a rebuilt team. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. Sawyer turned 34 last spring. He worked in commercial lending at a regional bank, smart with numbers, careful with people. He'd had a few relationships over the years, nothing that stuck. I never pushed. His mother would have pushed. I just waited. He called me on a Tuesday in February. Said he'd met someone he wanted me to meet. His voice had a different quality than usual. Faster, lighter, a little breathless. I'd heard that voice before, on his mother, the first time she told me about a trip to Portugal she'd booked without asking. It was the voice of someone who'd already decided. Her name was Renata Klein. They came over that Saturday. She walked into my front hallway and did something I noticed immediately. She didn't look at the family photos on the wall. She looked at the square footage. Her eyes swept the ceiling height, the original hardwood, the double-pane windows I'd put in myself in 2019. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then she smiled at me and said she'd heard so much about the house. Not about me, about the house. She was 31, attractive in a deliberate way, the kind of deliberate that takes real effort and wants you to know it. She said she worked in private wealth management, helping high-net-worth clients structure asset transfers. She used the phrase high net worth twice before we sat down. Over coffee, Sawyer told me how they'd met. Industry mixer, mutual connections. She'd asked a sharp question during his presentation on lending risk models. He'd been impressed. The courtship was 4 months old. They were talking about moving in together. I asked about her family. She said they were scattered, that she was never particularly close with them, that she preferred looking forward. I poured more coffee and said nothing. A week later, Sawyer called again. He wanted me to look at a prenuptial agreement Renata had suggested. He said it approvingly, said it showed maturity and financial clarity. He emailed it over that night. I read it twice before bed, and twice more the following morning. Clause 9 defined marital assets to include any inheritance received within the first 3 years of marriage. Clause 14 established that all property titled jointly within 6 months of the wedding would be subject to equal division regardless of source. The contract was 22 pages and had been drafted by an attorney I didn't recognize. I wrote one word in the margin of the printout. Why? The weeks that followed had a strange texture. On the surface, everything was normal. Sawyer came for dinner. Renata joined twice. She brought wine both times. Expensive labels I recognized from a restaurant Lorena and I had gone to on our 20th anniversary. She complimented the house twice more. She asked once, very casually, whether I'd thought about what I wanted to do with it eventually. I told her eventually was a long way off. She laughed and said she only meant that estate planning mattered, that families who talked about these things openly avoided so much pain later. She said it like she was doing me a favor. The thing about structural failure is it almost never announces itself. It builds. Hairline fractures first, then stress concentration. Then one day something gives way that everyone agreed was fine. I started paying closer attention. March arrived wet and cold. I had lunch scheduled with an old colleague, Daryl, at a steakhouse downtown near the Capitol building. He was late as usual. I was early as usual. I was reviewing notes on my phone when I saw them. Renata at a corner table near the back. A man across from her, late 40s, good suit, easy confidence. Her hand on his. Not her hand resting near his. Her hand on his, and his thumb moving in small circles on her wrist the way you do when touching someone is automatic. I sat very still. 40 years of fieldwork teaches you to evaluate before you act. You don't pull a support beam until you know what it's holding up. I didn't stand. I didn't walk over. I asked the hostess if I could move to a table with better light for my reading, gesturing toward a spot behind a column with a clean sight line to their table. For the next 25 minutes I watched. They shared a plate. They leaned close. When the check came, he paid without looking at the total. When they stood to leave, she kissed him on the cheek and held it there for a moment, her mouth near his ear. He said something that made her laugh. Not the laugh she used with me, the warm, careful one, but something unguarded and real. They left separately, 3 minutes apart. Darrell arrived 12 minutes late, with apologies about a meeting that ran long. I sat through lunch on autopilot. That evening I started making calls. I knew a man named Harlan Spear from a city infrastructure project we'd both worked on in the late 90s. He'd moved into private investigation afterward. Decent man, quiet. He picked up on the second ring and agreed to meet the next morning. I laid it out for him plainly. My son's fiancée, a prenuptial agreement with unusual clauses, an intimate lunch with an unidentified man. I needed her background investigated, prior relationships, financial patterns, anything that established who she was before Sawyer. Harlan asked one question. What would I do with what he found? I said I'd protect my son. He nodded and named his rate. I wrote him a check. The following 3 weeks moved slowly. I kept my Sunday dinners with Sawyer. I kept my voice even and my questions polite. Renata joined one of those dinners and spent 40 minutes asking me gentle questions about my pension structure and whether I'd considered converting any of my investment accounts into vehicles that were easier to transfer. She said Sawyer had mentioned I hadn't updated my estate documents since Lorena passed. I looked at my son. He shrugged, a little embarrassed. Said he'd just mentioned it in passing. I said I'd think about it. That night I called Harlan. He called me back 12 days later. Told me to come in, that I'd want to read the report somewhere I could sit down. The folder he handed me was 40 pages. Marriage certificate. Renata Klein to a man named Douglas Pruitt, married in Sacramento in 2018. Divorce filed 14 months later. Settlement, $160,000 and a vehicle. Second marriage certificate. Renata Klein to a man named Alton Marsh, married in Phoenix in 2021. Divorce filed 19 months after that. Settlement, $210,000 and a transfer of partial business equity. Surveillance photographs spanning the past 3 weeks. Renata and the man from the steakhouse, identified as Corbin Vell, a commercial real estate broker, meeting 8 times. Hotel lobbies. A condo building near the river. A restaurant I recognized on 5th Street. They'd been together at least 7 months. Sawyer had known her for 4. Harlan's handwritten note at the back of the folder said, "She's done this at least twice, possibly more." I sat in Harlan's office for a few minutes without speaking. Harlan said, "Show this to your son tonight." I said, "Not yet." He looked at me. I said, "If I approach this wrong, she'll spin it before he can think. I need the timing right." He said, "The engagement party is in 6 weeks." I said, "I know. I won't let it happen." I drove home with a folder that changed the weight of everything. I spent that evening at my dining table with the documents spread in front of me. The pattern was not subtle once you saw it. Targeted men in stable financial positions. Accelerated courtship. Prenuptial agreements with inheritance clauses designed to look protective while functioning as extraction tools. Marriage duration time to maximize asset access before exit. Each divorce cleaner and larger than the last. Sawyer wasn't in a relationship. He was a transaction. The next morning I called a family law attorney named Preston Hale, whose name I found through the Idaho State Bar's referral service. 31 years handling prenuptial disputes. He had an opening at 2 in the afternoon. Hale was a careful man. Read the prenuptial agreement without speaking, then read Harlan's report the same way. When he put them down, he said, the previous marriages establish a pattern of fraudulent inducement. The prenuptial itself contains provisions that would only benefit someone planning a short marriage with a specific extraction target in mind. If we can establish that she entered this engagement without disclosing prior marriages and with intent to defraud, the contract is voidable. He said I needed 2 things: testimony from at least one prior husband, and evidence of her current parallel relationship that predated the engagement. I said I could get both. He told me to document everything from that point forward. He mentioned Idaho's one-party consent law for recording conversations. He said to get Sawyer's permission to record family discussions, that I didn't need to say why, just that I wanted to preserve memories. I drove straight from Hale's office to see Harlan. Find Douglas Pruitt, I said, Sacramento, and Alton Marsh, Phoenix. I need to know if either of them will talk. Harlan found Pruitt first. He'd stayed in Sacramento, rebuilt his financial consulting practice over 2 years. When Harlan reached him and mentioned Renata's name, he asked one thing: how old is the new one? Harlan told him, 34. Pruitt said, "Tell his father I'll talk to him directly." I drove to Sacramento on a Thursday. Pruitt had chosen a coffee shop in a neighborhood called Land Park. Residential, quiet, the kind of place where nobody was performing anything for anyone. He was already there when I arrived. Mid-40s, fit, a stillness about him that suggested he'd spent a long time learning to hold things together. He shook my hand and looked at me carefully before he sat. I didn't rush. I asked how he was, 3 years out. He said better, that it had taken a long time, that the financial hit was only part of it. He'd lost a key partnership because she'd positioned herself as a business collaborator on paper. Recovery had taken 2 years. I told him I was trying to prevent my son from learning what he learned. He nodded and said, "You're fighting a professional." Over the next hour, he walked me through the entire arc. Networking event. She'd researched him before they met, knew his clients, asked smart questions about his sector. The engagement came at the 4-month mark. He'd been flattered by her certainty. The prenuptial had looked mutual. He hadn't understood that assets received from family sources had a specific legal meaning. His father died 11 months into the marriage and left him an estate. Per the contract, that became a marital asset. She filed 14 months in, just after the estate cleared probate. He said, "The whole thing was engineered from the beginning. I just didn't know what I was looking at." I showed him Harlan's report. He read it and went quiet. Then he pointed at a line in the transcript of one of my recorded conversations with Renata. He said, "She used those exact words with me. Estate planning is so important for blended families." She said it within a month of us meeting. "It's scripted," he said. "The whole thing is scripted." I asked if he'd be willing to provide a written statement, testify if necessary. He didn't hesitate. He said, "I should have spoken up when the investigator reached out after her second marriage. I knew. I didn't act. I've thought about that ever since." We drafted his statement together on his laptop. He signed it, had it notarized at a place 2 blocks away, and gave me his direct number. He said call any time, day or night. Before I left, he gave me one more piece. He said, "Your son won't believe you when you first tell him." I wouldn't have believed anyone. She creates a version of reality that makes skeptics look jealous and controlling. You need irrefutable proof delivered at a moment she can't reframe. Don't drip feed it. Everything at once. I said I understood. He said, "Good luck. I wish someone had been in your position for me." I drove back to Boise with his signed statement on the passenger seat. That same week, Sawyer called to cancel our Sunday dinner. Wedding venue walkthrough with Renata. He sounded apologetic. I told him, of course, no problem. It was the second cancellation in 3 weeks. I recognized the pattern from what Pruitt had described. Incremental isolation. Each excuse reasonable. The effect cumulative. I said nothing about it to Sawyer. Instead, I converted the spare bedroom into a working space. Corkboard on the wall, index cards, colored string. Center, Renata's photograph. Left column, timeline of her relationship with Sawyer. Right column, prior marriages with dates, settlements, documented tactics. Bottom, legal strategy mapped out with Hale. I photographed it daily. 2 weeks later, Harlan sent a message. Corbin Vell and Renata had met at a hotel near the airport. He'd gotten close enough to place a recorder in the hallway near the room. He said the audio was rough but clear enough. I downloaded the file and listened through headphones that night. Corridor sounds first, an elevator, then a door. Renata's voice closer to the microphone. 4 more months of this. Engagement party in 3 weeks. Wedding in August. Corbin's voice, lower. And the father? Renata, not a problem. I've been managing the distance. Sawyer barely calls him anymore. Corbin, you said that about Pruitt's brother. That almost went sideways. Renata, this is cleaner. Sawyer doesn't have siblings, doesn't have close friends who'd push back. The father's suspicious, but he has no way to act on it. After the wedding, the prenup kicks in. Give it 16 months. Corbin, 16 months of being a devoted wife. Renata laughed. Not her dinner party laugh, something else. He's easier than the others. He actually thinks I love him. I took the headphones off and sat in the quiet for a while. Then I called Hale and told him what I had. He said, "That's the case. That's everything we need." I said, "I need a little more time." He said, "The engagement party?" I said, "Yes." He said, "It's risky. She'll be in her element." I said, "That's exactly why." The weeks between that call and the engagement party were the strangest of my life. I saw Sawyer twice. He seemed happy in the particular way of someone who has stopped examining what they're happy about. Renata joined us for one dinner and spent the evening being warm and attentive and asking me twice about whether I'd spoken to an estate attorney yet. I told her I'd made an appointment. I hadn't. I assembled the evidence packets during the first week of August. 3 copies. Each one organized in sections with colored tabs. Section 1. Douglas Pruitt's notarized statement, with the original marriage certificate and divorce settlement attached. Section 2. Surveillance photographs of Renata and Corbin, dated and time-stamped, spanning 7 months. Section 3. Transcripts of recorded conversations in my home, with the financial probing highlighted. Section 4. The hotel corridor recording, transcribed with time markers. Section 5. Preston Hale's legal analysis of the prenuptial contract, with the fraudulent clauses annotated. I labeled the folders. The truth about Renata Klein. I met with Hale one more time before the party. He reviewed the packet and said it was thorough. He said the engagement party was a high-risk venue, but that the logic was sound. She'd be confident, her guard would be fully down, and the element of surprise would matter enormously. He also said, you need to think about where Sawyer goes after. She'll try to control his interpretation immediately. Have somewhere for him to process away from her. I'd already thought of it. My house. His old room, essentially unchanged. I packed a bag for him and put it in the hall closet. The party was on a Saturday evening in mid-August. Renata's friends had rented a private room at a restaurant in the North End. Exposed brick, Edison lights, a bar along one wall. About 60 guests, mostly people I didn't know. Sawyer's side was thinner than it should have been for a man who'd lived here his whole life. 3 colleagues I recognized. 2 friends from college who'd driven in. His supervisor from the bank. That was it. 6 weeks ago, Sawyer had a full social circle. I could see the pruning that had happened, the gentle steering away from people who might ask the wrong questions. Renata was radiant, the kind of radiant that's also a performance. She moved through the room with fluid ease, one hand always near Sawyer's arm, steering subtly whenever someone tried to pull him into a separate conversation. I stayed near the edges. Drank water. Watched. 40 minutes in. She crossed the room toward me. She touched my arm like we were close and leaned in. She said, I'm so glad you came. This means a lot to Sawyer. I said, of course. She held my eyes for a moment. Then her voice dropped. She said, I've been thinking. You've done your part. You raised him. You gave him everything he needed to get to this point. And now he has me. We're building something, and honestly, she paused, I think it'll be healthier for everyone if you give us space. Real space. Not just weekends. He needs to attach to our family now, not look backward. I said nothing. She said, I'm asking you nicely. Finish your drink. Congratulate us, and go. Tonight. And going forward, let us come to you. Don't push. I looked at her. I said, all right, Renata, I'll go. She relaxed. I said, but I'm taking someone with me. Something shifted in her face, a flicker, uncertain. She said, what does that mean? I said, you'll see. I set my glass down and walked toward my son. He was mid-conversation with his colleague near the bar. I touched his shoulder and said I needed 10 minutes privately before I left for the evening. He looked surprised. He looked toward Renata across the room. She was watching, her expression carefully composed. He said, is everything okay? I said, I need to show you something important. 10 minutes. The coat room off the hallway. He excused himself and followed me. The coat room was small, a rack of jackets along one wall, 2 chairs near a window. I closed the door. He stood with his arms crossed, not defensive exactly, but braced. He said, Dad, if this is about Renata. I said, it is. Sit down, please. 10 minutes. After that, you make every decision yourself. I just need 10 minutes. He sat. I put the folder on the table between us. I said everything in here was obtained legally. Nothing was fabricated. Douglas Pruitt is willing to testify in court to the contents of his statement. You can call him right now if you want. I opened to Section 1 and slid it across. He picked it up slowly. Read the first page of Pruitt's statement. His jaw shifted. He read faster, he said. She told me she'd never been married. I said, she's been married twice. He stared at the marriage certificate. I said, read Section 2. He turned to the photographs. 8 months of documentation. Renata and Corbin. Hotels, restaurants, his building, the week before last. Sawyer's hands went flat on the table. He said, who is that? I said his name. Real estate broker. They'd been together since before Sawyer knew her. Sawyer picked up one of the photographs and held it. Set it down. He said, you hired someone to follow her. I said, I hired someone after I saw them together by accident. I had to choose between a single observation and doing nothing, or building a case you'd actually believe. You wouldn't have believed a single photograph. You know that. He said nothing. I said, there's more. I need you to listen to something. I opened my phone and played the hotel recording. The room went very quiet. Renata's voice came through the speaker, clear enough. He actually thinks I love him. And then the laugh. Both of them. Sawyer sat without moving for a long time. He said, "That's her voice." I said, "Yes." He said, "16 months." I said, "Yes." He stood, walked to the window, stood with his back to me. He said, "She planned it before we met." I said, "The pattern from the 2 prior marriages suggests yes." He turned around. His face had gone very still in the way that meant he was holding something extremely carefully. He said, "What do I do right now?" I said, "That's your decision. You can go back in there and continue the party, or you can end it. I'll support either choice tonight. But you should know Hale has already prepared paperwork to void the prenuptial contract on the grounds of fraud, and Pruitt will testify." He said, "She's been lying since the beginning." I said, "Yes." He picked up the folder, held it, set it back down. He said, "I'm ending it." He opened the door and walked down the hallway into the party. I followed. The room was mid-conversation when we came in. Renata saw us immediately. She started moving toward Sawyer with a smile that lasted until she saw his face. He stopped in the middle of the room. He said, clearly enough for the room to hear, "I need to tell everyone something. The engagement is off. I'm sorry to anyone who came a long distance. That means a lot, and I'm sorry for the confusion. But this isn't happening. Please enjoy the rest of your evening." Renata said his name, said it twice. Her voice shifted registers from warm to urgent. He looked at her and said, "I heard the recording, Renata." She said, "Whatever he showed you is manipulated. It's out of context." He said, 16 months. That's what you said. 16 months playing devoted wife." The room had gone completely silent. She turned to me. Her voice had changed again into something harder. She said, "You have no idea what you've done. I'll have you in court. I'll take everything." I said, "The contract is void due to fraud. Preston Hale has already filed the motion. And Idaho's one-party consent law covers everything I recorded. Your attorney will confirm it." She said something else, but Sawyer was already walking. I followed him through the door. Outside, the August night was warm and dry, which felt wrong for the occasion. We stood in the parking lot for a moment. He had his jacket still from inside, and he hadn't bothered with it. He stood with his hands at his sides, looking at the middle distance. He said, "I need to get out of here." I said, "My car's right there." We drove without talking for most of it. "Somewhere on the interstate," he said very quietly. "How long did you know?" I said, "I started suspecting in March. I had enough to be certain by May." He said, "Why didn't you tell me then?" I said, "Pruitt warned me you wouldn't believe a partial case. She would have explained everything individually and made me look paranoid. I needed you to see the complete picture at once." He said, "Would I have believed you?" I thought about it, honestly. I said, "No, probably not." He looked out the window. He stayed in the guest room that night. In the morning he came down and asked for coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table without needing to perform anything for each other. That was the first time in several months I felt like I had my son back. 2 weeks later, Hale filed the counter motion. Renata's attorney had sent a demand letter seeking damages for breach implied contract and emotional harm. Hale called it optimistic. The hearing was in a small courtroom downtown. Renata sat at the plaintiff's table in a suit that probably cost more than my first car. Douglas Pruitt flew in from Sacramento. He took the stand and answered every question in the flat, clear voice of someone who had gone over this a long time ago, and made peace with the fact that it had to be said. Renata's attorney tried to rattle him, asked whether he harbored resentment, whether his contact with Sawyer constituted a campaign of harassment. Pruitt said, "I contacted this man's father to prevent him from experiencing what I experienced. That's not harassment. That's what decent people do." The judge, a man named Walford Gaines, who had the affect of someone who had heard every variation of human deception and was no longer surprised by any of it, asked to hear the recording directly. The courtroom heard Renata's voice. 16 months playing devoted wife. He actually thinks I love him. Judge Gaines let it play to the end. He ruled from the bench. Prenuptial agreement voided in full on grounds of fraudulent inducement and material misrepresentation. Plaintiff's claims for damages dismissed. Evidence referred to the Ada County District Attorney for review of potential fraud charges. As the gavel came down, Renata's attorney was already leaning in to talk to her. Outside the courthouse, Sawyer stood on the steps and squinted into the afternoon sun. Hale shook our hands and said we'd hear from the DA's office within a few weeks, that the evidence was comprehensive, that she'd likely be offered a plea. Sawyer didn't say much until we reached the parking garage. Then he said, "She called me easier than the others." I said, yes. He said, that's the part that stays with me. I said I understood that. I told him that it stays because it was designed to. That's how she ensured her targets blamed themselves, instead of recognizing the system she ran. He was quiet for a minute. He said, I should have seen it. I said, a professional con is built specifically so the target can't see it. That's not a character flaw. That's the design. He said, you saw it. I said, I was outside it. That's the only difference. We drove home. Hale called 6 weeks later to say Renata had accepted a plea arrangement. 3 years probation, full restitution to Pruitt and Marsh, a criminal record that would follow the professional licenses she'd need to rebuild. She left Boise. Harlan said she'd moved to a city in the Southwest that he wouldn't name without a formal inquiry. It was a Friday in late October when Sawyer came over for dinner, and we sat on the back porch after, the kind of cold that's coming but hasn't arrived yet, the garden going brown at the edges. He had a glass of bourbon. I had coffee. He said, I've been thinking about what you did, building that case for months, not telling me, waiting for the right moment. I said, it was the only way. He said, it must have been hard to watch and say nothing. I said, yes. He said, I'm sorry I made it harder. The dinners I canceled. The way I stopped calling. I said, she was doing her job. It worked the way it was designed to. You don't apologize to me for that. He turned his glass in his hands. He said, she said I barely had anyone except you. She said it like that was a weakness she could use. I said it was her mistake. She thought it made you isolated. It just meant the only person who could see what she was doing was someone with no reason not to act on it. He looked at me, he said, I'm glad you're stubborn. I said, I'm an engineer. We check the math twice and then we check it again. He smiled. First real one in a long time. We sat there until the cold made it necessary to go inside. He helped me with the dishes without being asked, the way he used to when he was 17, and we were both figuring out how to be around each other without Lorena. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. Some structures hold because of their design. Some hold because someone built them carefully and checked every joint. I'd spent 38 years learning the difference. This one held.